They fell from the sky like a red rain that never stopped. The first spores were mistaken for meteors, thin scratches of fire across the dark, a night watch curiosity above Macragge's winter hemisphere. Then the augurs bloomed with impossible returns, and the rain never ceased, and the rain opened its teeth. Macragge was not a fearful world. It was iron-disciplined and law-straight, a planet that had taught generations of soldiers to keep their lines even when the blizzard scoured the lungs raw. It had birthed a legion's heart and drilled into its citizens the simple mathematics of duty. Do your work, hold your ground, pay the price required. When the sky began to hatch, that old equation was put to a test no one had written a number for. Warning sirens crawled over the cities and manufactorums like metal insects. Servitors collapsed cogitator gates across civil traffic and turned the roads to military arteries. In the cold north, the bastions at the pole shook frost from their flanks and spoke to one another in coded whispers, exchanging ranges, fuel states, firing arcs. Men and women who had trained their whole lives for neat wars with neat enemies learned what it meant to face something that hungered for the idea of them. The first chittens broke against outer pickets with a sound like plates dropped in a cathedral. Gaunt shapes with too many limbs and not enough mercy scissored over rockcrete and wire. Flamer crews did careful work at indecent speed, painting lines of chemical fire while their rangefinders ticked further and further in disbelief. On the walls, auto turrets chattered until their heat sinks glowed. In the snowfields between bastion and mountain, the first piles rose. Tyranid bodies burnt to tar and frozen into obscene cairns by the wind. The Ultramarines met the invasion with the only answer they had ever considered correct. They made a line and told it to hold. Marneus Calgar, Lord of Macragge, stood not as a hero on a parapet, but as a node in a machine of war, so wide it extended from orbit to ocean trench. Plasteel decking trembled under his armored weight as he paced the command gallery of the fortress monastery, and listened to a dozen voices at once. Fleet status from the void, polar reports from the North Citadel, vox from the civilians, targeting overlays from the fortress guns. He received it all and broke it into orders, clean cuts made by a practiced blade. Reinforce the westward trench line, groundburst that spore cluster, redirect Angels of Iax to the north approach, lock down Silo 9, recall Tempest squads to the inner redoubt, prepare bombardment on my mark. He watched the orbital returns like a high priest reading omens made of fire. Above, Hive Fleet Behemoth wrote a language no priest wanted to learn. Its living ships were more storm than fleet, a great, slow, furious grinding of will that turned void into throat and swallowed what resisted. Macragge's battle barges and strike cruisers fought in a geometry of death, wedge and counter-wedge, lance and void shield, torpedo spread and cold ramming. It was a beautiful violence if you did not listen too long to what it cost. The bridge of the Macragge's honor bled sparks like iron rain. The Valen's revenge died with both engines screaming. The Iaxian sun bought 20 minutes by burning itself to a white wound in the swarm. On the ground, minutes were sold over and over for the same price. The polar fortresses were old and without romance. Mass and angle, buried adamantine, corridors that taught you humility by their scale. For centuries, they had looked out over the ice and found nothing worth firing at. Now, they are the only reason an entire hemisphere had not yet slid into a mouth. The first company took the walls there, veterans with eyes that had forgotten how to widen, wearing armor that carried histories like scars. They did not boast. They adjusted fields of fire. They checked seals. They stood in the cold and understood that their names would be written in stone or snow, and perhaps there would be no difference between the two when it was finished. The first true wave came with a sky that had turned the color of old meat. It moved as if it shared a pulse, thousands of bodies called by one drum, every stride a syllable. It hit minefields and lost parts and kept speaking. It hit wire and threw bodies on wire and used them as bridges. It hit fire and learned how to walk on flame. When a Carnifex reached the wall, it moved like an avalanche had decided to stand upright. It threw itself against the bastion plates until the plates rang like bells, then tore the bells down. A veteran sergeant met it with a team that had fought 4 Black Crusades and thought they had seen big things before. Meltaguns opened like suns at stone's throw. The Carnifex staggered, boiled, bellowed quietly as if its throat was stuck with metal and kept climbing. Chainsword teeth chewed into armor and snapped loose. At last, a crack charge found something that counted, and the thing slumped into the embrasure like a dead god steaming on the ice. There were more. In the maintenance galleries beneath the line, Tech Marines did violent surgeries on the fortress spirit so the guns could keep talking. On the inner wards, apothecaries built triage out of ritual and grit, filling the air with the incense of promethium and blood. In a feeder trench, a storm of Tyranid spines found a brother's helm and turned the world's sound to ocean for him. He kept firing, counting mechanically, because counting was merciful. 3 bursts, swap the pack. 3 bursts, swap the pack. Repeat until you could not justify doing it again. From the north, the wind carried a sweet stink that made the tongue recoil. Spores hatched into organisms that were not yet fully decided, quivering sacs that tried to be useful and sometimes managed nothing but dying in ugly ways. Spore chimneys rose like tumors, and bioplasma laughed across the ice in arcs that left afterimages on the retina. Beneath the ground, capillary towers found the stone and drank it. The planet was learning how to be food. In orbit, the math reached a cliff. The swarm had more answers than the fleet had questions, and each ship that died reduced the quality of the questions. Calgar took the truth as he took everything, without ceremony. He gave the order the fortress had been holding in its heart. Prepare for separation. Prepare for solitude. The poles would be left to their own numbers. The last dropships fell like tears through a sky choked with creatures. Some were caught by living nets and split open to spill blue giants into the snow. Others broke through and delivered men to the walls who were already counting their minutes. And the walls accepted them with the clicks and thuds of closing doors. Night took the polar world and held it for days. They fought by muzzle flash and Auspex ghost, by the green fizz of biofluids and the careful, flat light of lumen strips. Ammunition became more sacred than prayers. Generators thumped like hearts in metal chests. When the worms came, long, blind drills of bone and hunger. The floor bulged, and rivets shrieked from their holes, and boarding shields held the length of corridors, while power fists turned the first heads into paste. When the second heads came, they were faster. In the eastern redoubt, Brother Captain Agamon's vox guttered with static and hunger. He spoke as if it were a small thing that the outer curtain wall no longer existed. He said the line was now the line, and would please be treated with the respect owed to lines. He apologized for the delay in returning a salute to a brother company master who had died an hour earlier. He asked for more flamer tanks with a courtesy that made the request obscene. Then the vox cut to a scream, and then a silence that lasted the rest of the night. Storms wandered the ice without permission. They closed like giant hands over the bastions and shook them. The Tyranids loved the storms. They made their advances into whispers. More than once, a Gaunt's scythe found a gap in a pauldron because the wind hid its approach in 1,000 loose fingers. More than once, a warrior form broke through a choke point and stamped a brother twice before anyone could choose a target. More than once, a Tervagon squatted in the lee of a wreck and brought a platoon of children screeching wet into the world, while the wreck steamed and the wind sang. Between assaults, the Marines stood in lines, because lines were still the right shape. They drank water that tasted of iron and the inside of old pipes. They spoke rarely. When they did, it was logistics. The number of grenades that could be spared, the state of the left-hand Auspex, the name of the brother who would take the point when the next hatch blew inward. They called each other by title and rank because names were breakable. In a lull that lasted perhaps an hour, perhaps 5 minutes, a brother placed his hand on the wall and felt it breathe. He realized with a clarity as clean as frost that the fortress was alive in a way machines ought not to be. It wanted to endure. It did not love them. It simply wanted to continue being a fortress. He took comfort from that, though he could not have said why. Then the ground tried to stand up. The main push began with a sound like a choir learning the wrong hymn at blade point. The air filled with a million insectile arguments. Out beyond the trenches, the snow lifted in curtains as tunneling creatures broke the surface in concert, hundreds of holes waking at once. Mycetic spores smashed into the parapets and opened into flowers that thought bolt shells were bees. Warriors came in ranks like bad dreams that had learned file discipline. Above it all, a shape like a cathedral peeled itself from the smoke and revealed iron-bound wings. A hive tyrant strode forward as if it had already written what would happen next. The first company met it because there was no one else left to do so. The fight in the North Bastion's killyard bent time. Bolters spoke until throats failed. Crack grenades did work honest enough to earn their names. A dreadnought shouldered through a wall and showed the tyrant a memory of some older war in which titans argued, and for a moment even that brain, clotted by purpose, hesitated. Then a Carnifex hit the dreadnought from the side, and the argument ended with a crash that threw teeth into the snow. Brothers fell and were caught and set on their feet and fell again. A veteran placed a melta-charge with the care of a jeweler. He did not live to see it fire. He left the charge where he had set it because there was no better place. At last, the tyrant reached the inner gate. It struck with a sword grown from itself and a lash grown from something it had eaten. Calgar met it. No bard will tell you he was beautiful in that moment. He was a machine built for an answer. Thunder hammered from his gauntlets, and the gate shook with the echo of their exchange. The hive tyrant's blade took a bite from his plate the size of a hand. Calgar's fist crushed a torso segment until the spine inside it made an ugly music. Around them, the battle did not stop to watch. A gaunt ran up Calgar's back like a ladder. An honor guard plucked it free and split it with a movement old as smithing. Bioplasma struck the wall and turned ice to glass that shattered in slow sheets. The tyrant's lash wrapped Calgar's forearm and chewed sparks. His other hand drove forward, a thunderhead inside a steel glove, and the tyrant's head broke apart like pottery. It did not die. It wanted to, maybe, but wanting was not what these things did. It fell backward, and its nearest children tried to pick it up like ants with a leaf. "Forward," Calgar said. He did not need to shout. His vox carried the gravity of the word to every place it needed to be. They moved, and for a little while, a line that should only have retreated learned to advance. The little while ended when the ammunition did. Bolters clicked empties like hunger pangs. Power packs flashed warning runes. The fortress spirit whispered its own cautions in a vocabulary of dwindling. The Techmarines answered with small cruelties. Cannibalize this feed to buy 5 minutes of that one. Strip the eastern turret to keep the western alive long enough to matter. Break the thing that is most expensive so the thing that is least may continue to fire.
Apothecaries worked with knives and glue and prayers. They ran out of prayers first. When the inner corridors finally caved, it was not because the walls were weak. It was because they had done their work. In the last chambers, brothers fought in piles. The piles were not metaphor. They climbed bodies to reach things that needed killing. They defended doors that no longer opened, and hung banners that no longer convinced anyone. They fought until the word "until" had no meaning. And then, silence. It was a silence that did not belong to victory. It was the silence of a mouth finally closed after a long meal. Snow fell through a hole in a roof that had not been there the day before. The flakes landed on armor that steamed and cooled and stopped steaming. The fortress breathed and then decided not to. Lights failed in a stately sequence, like chandeliers going out in a palace under ocean.
In orbit, the relief came late in the way that all relief does when there is no such thing as soon enough. The fleet that had promised itself it would not break broke the swarm's back between blast waves and stubbornness. The hive ships died like cities collapsing, and the cities falling into them did not slow. When the fire was done and the void went back to being black instead of red, the Ultramarines ships that still had engines turned their faces to the pole and fell. The first squads into the ruins of the North Fortress moved as if they were entering a church where they had sinned. Helm lamps found carvings on the inside of doors, quick scratches, unit notations, a joke left by a brother who had wanted to make someone smile after him. The air tasted of coin and meat. In the galleries, the snow had begun to reclaim the warmth and turn it into white. In a stairwell, a brother sat with his back to the wall and a broken sword in his lap, as if he were only resting. In the kill yard, they found a heap of xenos stacked 4 meters high by the geometry of necessity, and one blue pauldron resting on the top like a standard. The mark of the first company lay upon it. A sergeant knelt, reached out, and did not touch. He spoke a name that came out stranger than he had meant it to. They counted because that was what they had left to do. They counted the living, and the number was small. They counted the dead, and the number could not be held in a single mind without it changing that mind. They counted the minutes since the last shot had been fired, and found that the silence had lasted only as long as a breath held under ice. Calgar stood in a hall that had once echoed with drill cadence and now echoed with nothing. His armor was a map of the night. The gauntlets that had broken a tyrant hung at his sides, patient. He looked at the men who remained and saw that they had learned a terrible skill. They knew how to keep breathing when there was no reason to. He nodded. It was enough. Macragge endured. It had been bitten and bled and taught a new arithmetic in which the answer was never clean. Its ice fields gleamed with a crust of things that did not belong to snow. Its cities burned in places, and in other places stood still, quiet,
waiting for orders and for the hands to carry them out. The polar bastions did not raise their banners again that week. Perhaps they would later, perhaps they would not. The stone did not care. The galaxy learned a lesson in those days that it would pretend to forget and then be forced to remember. Some hungers cannot be bargained with. Some storms never stop. And some lines are not drawn to hold the enemy, but to teach the men behind them who they are. On Macragge, the Ultramarines stood the length of one winter night against a beast made of mouths. And when morning came, there were fewer of them to see it. The light touched armor and ice and the open, empty eyes of things that would have eaten the sun if they could have reached it. A servitor cleared a corridor with a broom older than itself. A child in the city below woke from a nightmare about teeth and discovered it had been dreaming the truth. In a vault under the fortress, a single lumen strip flickered and died without anyone to notice. On the parapet, a brother watched the horizon and saw only white. He felt the absence of familiar voices like a wind through a ruin. He gripped the stone with a gauntlet that had forgotten how to stop, and whispered the simplest vow a soldier can make. Hold. The word went nowhere and everywhere. It had been said by better men and would be said again by worse. It did not solve anything. It did not need to. The snow blew. The hive ships smoldered in silent falling arcs. The polar fortress stood. And far away, in a dark for which the word night is too small, something else listened and learned and added Macragge to the list of things it would like to eat if it could. The red rain had ended. The work did not.